In winter of 2000, former Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird decided to give to the Ford Presidential Library an extensive collection of his personal papers from his quite astonishing public career. And shortly thereafter, Secretary Laird contacted me, and he advised me, and he's never written a memoir. He's never written a memoir. But he contacted me and said that he was working with a journalist, Dale Van Atta, on an authorized biography. And that's when I first met our speaker tonight, Dale, is when he came to do research here in the Ford papers for the book. Well, over the years, I've eagerly anticipated the biography through Dale's reference queries, Secretary Laird's periodic donation of additional papers as he completed and Dale completed use of the materials in Washington. We received a donation of chapters and draft chapters of the book over the time. And especially we received what will be a wonderful collection in future years, are hundreds of interviews that Dale conducted in research for the book. Now, I've been waiting for this book, and when it arrived at work, I took it home. I was anxious to see. I popped it open to the middle. I thought, well, I'll randomly start with the first chapter I come upon, which turned out to be on the secret war in Laos. And it was terrific. And I just kept reading to the end, and then I went back to the beginning of the book. Dale's an investigative reporter, and I learned from Wikipedia, and maybe you're learning this from Wikipedia too, because who knows if it's true, that you're also a novelist? Yes. Okay. He's the author of a biography of General Norman Schwarzkopf, a history of AARP. He's probed deeply into the murky underworld of Middle East terrorism and had done so before 9/11. He was a personal friend of journalist Jack Anderson. Dale co-wrote the column Washington Merry-Go-Round for many years. And his investigative reporting focused on national security matters. I can testify that he had excellent sources in his national security reporting, because one of the most remarkable collections in this library is one that Dale himself donated, the Van Atta papers. It's a vast collection of CIA intelligence reports from the 1970s. So tonight, kicking off one of the most ambitious speakers programs in Ford Library history, I'm pleased to turn over the mic to Dale Van Atta.
I am delighted to be here, and I was trying to remember when it was I was here doing the research, and it became easy to remember because the day I came to do research, the previous evening, Donald Rumsfeld had been announced as the new Secretary of Defense. And the library was full of journalists from all over the country, just like they're in Alaska now, trying to find out what Donald Rumsfeld did as Chief of Staff for Jerry Ford. I was a co-columnist with Jack Anderson, as you mentioned, for many years, and Jack always said, that we were muckrakers, which I always disagreed with until at one point I went to the South Pole in Antarctica. And it was myself, a man from Time magazine, a man from New York Times, and National Geographic, and a guy with Jack Anderson. And everywhere I went, people were leaking me documents and everything. When I got to the South Pole itself, the geodesic dome that sits on 9,000 feet of ice that moves 10 feet every year, we had some free time. They all went to talk to the scientists about the ozone hole and all kinds of other things. And a guy grabbed me in kind of Levi's, and he was very greasy, and says, I have something to show you. You're the guy with Jack Anderson. You're a muckrake. I said, yes. He said, I got a story bigger than Watergate. That's how you always knew. Wondered whether it was going to be anything. I had to put on the 60 pounds of clothing, go out to the minus 60-degree temperatures, and he took me through a manhole cover, walked down these steps, along this pipe. The smell was very distinctive. And at the end was this very large pool of you-know-what, and steaming, because it was hotter than the ice. And he said, you see, this is the scandal. We're back under the South Pole Station itself, the dome. And the South Pole Station is sinking a foot each year into its own blank, fill in the blank. And as I surveyed this brown pole at the bottom of the earth, I just acknowledged to Jack, yes, I'm a muckraker. Maybe a junior muckraker at that. The papers that he mentioned, the most humorous thing to me about that, it was pretty much everything the CIA and all the intelligence agents and everyone sent forward during a year's period of time. And we mined it for column after column, never trying to betray sources and methods. And I was always worried about where to hide it. You know, we were always worried about the KGB going through the trash. I burned everything. If I was not going to use anything anymore, I burned it. And so it was hid in various wild places. And I finally called David and said, I'm tired of having these things, but they have great historical value because the CIA will never give you these. You can ask them for them, but it covers Ford's time period. And he said, yes, we'd love to have them. Well, a few days later, this security truck came, an armored security truck, and guards from the National Archives. And I started laying out these documents, all of which were above top secret. They were what we call code word. And it had the names of NSA agents and all kinds of people abroad. I was always very careful with them. Probably used only 1% of them that I felt was safe. And as he took them, he said to me, you realize, Mr. Van Atta, now that I've taken possession of them, you cannot look at them. You are not cleared to see classified information. I said, yes. So is this not true, David? I cannot see my own collection. It's still being cleared. So the Van Atta papers, unfortunately, are the hidden papers. Mel Laird. And the reason for doing this book, for years I had heard about Mel, and what intrigued me most about him was here was a man who somehow came out of the Nixon administration, having been in the middle of the Vietnam War, and it appeared to be there at the same time as Watergate. How could he come out with his honor intact, if not enhanced? And that was the initial query that started it. I met with him a couple times. As you read in the acknowledgments, hopefully some of you will get the book, you'll see it took me 4 years to persuade him to let me do it. Originally, it was going to be an autobiography where I would just write it in I form for him. You think that's unusual for statesmen? All right, can I tell you an inside story? Don't tell anyone else, turn off the camera. The foreword in this book is by Gerald Ford. If I'm correct, Mel told me it was the only one he ever wrote, because he was always afraid of doing a foreword if one person, like Dr. McCracken, somebody who worked with him, asked for a foreword for their book, which would make it sell better, then how could he say no to anyone? So rather than accept any one of thousands of requests, he normally turned them down. He may have done a couple. But Mel said, this is a great honor. He said, there's only one problem. Ford was in the hospital at the time. This was the last thing he did. He asked me if you were still working with him. He said, is Dale Van Atta still working for you? Can he help me a little with the foreword? And I said, okay. What I didn't tell Mel is 3 or 4 days before, the Wall Street Journal had approached me and said they wanted a column from Mel, an obituary on Gerald Ford, to be run after Ford died. So in the same week, I found myself being Gerald Ford and Mel Laird writing about each other. So sometimes it gets a little confusing, but I had a greater appreciation of William Shakespeare stepping into various characters. 40 years ago, we were in a situation in some ways similar to today, although the economy now has outdistanced the Iraq War. But we were in the middle of a very unpopular war. We had 2 candidates running who, for the first time in 16 years, were neither an incumbent vice president or president. One of the things that makes it so historic in the election currently is for many years we have not had someone, we've always had an incumbent vice president or president running. And that's when everything's kind of up for grabs during this very crucial time. For those of you who don't know, I always like to tell this story because Mel did not want to be Secretary of Defense. his great love was the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, things he had spent years building up. Marshfield Clinic in Marshfield, Wisconsin, the McArdle Cancer Center there in Madison. As the number 2 on the Appropriations Committee for years, the House Medical Appropriations Committee, he was pleased to increase funding for federal research on the medical arena. And that's what he wanted to be remembered for. He was number 2 in the House behind Jerry Ford, whom he had put in that position time and again, as may become clear in the book, but I didn't hit it hard. He had the opportunity to be the leader, to contest it with Ford. In fact, and this is not in the book, but he was asked first, even by Ford and by the leaders on the Hill, if he would replace Spiro Agnew. So for about 30 to 40 seconds, Mel had the opportunity to become the only unelected president we've ever had without ever campaigning for the presidency. But his instinct was that the man we needed was Jerry Ford. So he said no. But I will do everything I can to promote Ford, and I'll talk a little about that at the end because it's an extraordinary story. But he never wanted to be Secretary of Defense. He had already turned down, Nixon had asked him, a good friend of his, Richard Nixon, for years. And there are various clubs and societies in Washington where people associate, and that's where the real work gets done. And that's where the associations are made. Burning Tree Country Club, of course, for Ford and Bob Michael and many others, a male-only club out there. The only time a female was able to get onto that golf course is when her plane crashed on it. And she walked away very quickly. They ushered her out. They paid a lot of money to keep that private. But there was this other club called the Chowder and Marching Society. It started by Nixon and Jerry Ford and some in the 40s, and Mel joined it very early when he came on. And like a lot of the clubs, what they looked for were people who were on committees that could report to them every week what was going on in executive session. So it wasn't just a policy-making club, it was a way to also gather intelligence on what was going on in a very quick way from people who were sitting in all those meetings. And Laird was positioned so well because he was on the Appropriations Committee. He was number 2 on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and he was number 1 in terms of Republicans on the Health Appropriations Subcommittee. So in those days, it meant he was controlling 70% of the U.S. budget and becoming an expert in all those areas. Ford was number 1, working with him on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, ranking member. The Republicans weren't in charge then. If Mel had been asked what does he really want to be at the time, he would have said Speaker of the House. I'm no longer convinced that's true. I think what he truly wished to be, his greatest ambition, was to be chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, because he always felt at that time it was a much more powerful position than today with Congressman Obey, because there weren't so many committees that had to sign off on budget documents. That was an all-powerful position. So the last thing he wanted to be was Secretary of Defense. As I said, he had turned down Secretary of Health. And he had arranged, he was working behind the scenes to create Nixon's cabinet. Nixon wanted to be the first president ever to announce all cabinet members at once with a photo op front page of the New York Times to show that he was in charge and he knew what he was doing. So Mel had convinced him that he needed to have a Democrat in his cabinet. And he had talked to a man named Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. And Scoop, who was a hardliner when it came to defense and the Soviet Union, said yes, he would be glad to be Secretary of Defense, even though he had presidential ambitions. So now we're talking 40 years ago, December 68. He goes off on this retreat for Democrats facing this new Republican administration in Hawaii. And Ted Kennedy corners him and says, I hear you've agreed to be Secretary of Defense for Nixon. And he said yes. He said, if you do that, not only will the Democrats not support you to become president, but it's unlikely you would ever be president. It will take your reputation down. Even though you've given your word, you better take it back. Now, the thing that was so extraordinary is Mel had gone one step further because Scoop Jackson had asked for one condition that normally was undoable, and that was, if I am no longer a senator from the state of Washington, and I have as my governor a Republican governor, I ask you to get him to pledge secretly that he will choose a Democratic senator, not someone from his own party, to replace me. Governor Dan Evans, with Mel's urging, agreed to do so to help Richard Nixon. So they had even had that deal in the works. From Hawaii, Mel gets a call from Scoop Jackson saying, "I'm sorry, I can't do it." He gave no explanation. He found out later it was the meeting with Ted Kennedy. Mel is now at the Republican Governors Association in Palm Springs with Jerry Ford and Richard Nixon and others. And Nixon comes up to him and says, "I heard Scoop said no," after he already said yes. "I'm announcing in a few days. I would like you to be Defense Secretary." And Mel said, "Absolutely not. I already turned you down. I'll lose the power I have on the Hill now. I can help you better from Congress." And he said, "Well, we'll talk about it a little more." On the plane back to Andrews Air Force Base from Palm Springs, California, they drank quite a few drinks. And by the time they were coming into Washington, D.C., they were both a little soused, he's admitted to me. And Nixon was still pressing him, and he knew he couldn't turn down, for patriotic reasons, couldn't turn down the president-elect of the United States. So Mel was thinking quickly, even in the state that he was in, and he thought, I've got one condition I can force upon him, which he cannot agree to. And those of you who know politics, Dr. McCracken and others, David, this is an extraordinary thing. What he said to him was, I would only accept being Secretary of Defense if you as the President and the White House can never tell me who to appoint in any position at the Pentagon. You cannot have a say. You can recommend, but you can't have a say. And Nixon thought for a minute and said, okay. He knew he needed Mel. And Mel didn't trust Richard Nixon. I wonder why. So he said, I want you to write it on a piece of paper right now that this is the pledge you've given me if you announce me as Secretary of Defense. And Nixon said, okay. They didn't have anything except a cocktail napkin. So with a ballpoint pen on a cocktail napkin, Richard Nixon wrote that Mel could pick whoever he wanted and the White House couldn't say boo. And Mel carried that for 2 years in his top pocket so that any White House staffer would call and say, the president has insisted that you put this. The reason this is such a big deal is the Pentagon is the largest patronage plum place for paying off all your campaign workers. If you want to know where most of Obama or McCain's people will go that have contributed a lot of money besides being ambassadors, a lot of them will go to the Pentagon. And in fact, very rarely, I'm thinking only 1 or 2 times, was the Secretary of Defense able to pick his own deputy. Usually the number 2 position in the Pentagon was picked in the first part of this administration by Dick Cheney. But through the president. It wasn't picked by Rumsfeld. It wasn't his choice, that first choice. So he agreed to it, and Mel was stuck, and he was announced. And his wife and children were upset. I checked on a survey once. It seemed like the majority of the children of anyone Mel asked to work in the Pentagon was against the war, and appalled that their fathers or mothers, in whatever case, would actually be working in the Pentagon as part of the Vietnam War. So it was an intensely patriotic thing for any of these men to accept, and for that, they deserve homage on their own. Late September, 40 years ago, Mel slipped one line into candidate Richard Nixon's radio address, which Nixon didn't see, apparently, before he read it. And that will come back later. But the line was, and I pledge to end the draft, which was very unpopular then. Well, after Mel becomes Secretary of Defense, he says 2 things to Nixon. He said, looks like you've been elected because you have a secret plan to get us out of the Vietnam War. What is your secret plan now that I'm Secretary of Defense? And Nixon said, I don't have one. You'll have to come up with it. He had never stated it one way or another, so it was up to Mel. And Mel crafted, he was the father of what's called Vietnamization. And everyone agrees to that. Everyone I interviewed knew that it was Mel. He pushed it through, he termed it, and that was to get Americans out of the war as soon as possible by honestly transferring the fighting to the Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese. And to do that, it was nuts and bolts. They had to immediately, within a couple months, put all the aircraft, all the missiles, everything they had, those parts manuals had to be translated into Vietnamese. They had to do enormous things to bring them up to snuff, to use all the equipment alone besides the training, the military training that was needed. In Mel's view, and there are historians who certainly disagree with this, in Mel's view, Vietnamization, his part of it, it was always a three-pronged program. It was military, which was Mel's part. It was supposed to be economic as well. And it was supposed to be political, changing the corrupt system in South Vietnam to a more democratically elected government, which was not overrun by corruption, which that government was. Mel will always say they fought for 2 years after we left. And 2 years pretty much when Congress had cut funding to the South Vietnamese. And when they lost in April 1975, when that fell, when President Ford was president, in many places they did not have ammunition for their weapons. The supply line had been cut off at the same time as the Soviet Union was still, despite the peace accord, still pumping $1 billion a year into the North Vietnamese military and the parts there. But he also said to him, we need to end the draft. Do you really believe in that? He said, well, let's think about it for a while. Let's call a commission. Well, Mel could see right away two things. He saw that Nixon really may have thought deep down inside, and you read their memoirs carefully, Kissinger and Nixon may still have thought the Vietnam War was winnable when they started the administration, despite the pledges that had been made for peace. Mel was convinced otherwise. And Mel operated in effect as his own independent power. That's what fascinated me the most. Mel Laird, for at least the first 2 years, was as powerful in military matters as Kissinger or Nixon himself. And quite often, he was opposed to Nixon, though he wouldn't ever say it. He would do things behind the scenes. They were afraid of Mel. Read Kissinger's memoirs. In fact, there was one thing I enjoyed that I'd like to read you that Kissinger wrote. He said, no man can handle Mel Laird. So I always had some deputy who had to do the preliminary skirmishing so that I might find out at least where the battlefield was. And there were a number of guidelines. Guideline 1, Mel Laird is extremely smart. Guideline 2, he knows he's extremely smart. Guideline 3, he will let you know he's extremely smart. Guideline 4, it is much less painful to do what he wants than to refuse what he wants. And the example he gave is, in his memoirs, there were more examples he could have given. There was nothing the White House could do that Mel, if he wanted to, couldn't prevent. Because what you need to remember coming into 1969, or need to know, is Mel had 50 times more congressional friends than Nixon did, and 1,000 times more than Kissinger. Kissinger was a Harvard professor who came in with virtually no friends on the Hill and no friends in the media. Mel knew everyone in the media, and he knew the Hill, and they all liked him because he was always honest with them. He had a lot of friends and a lot of loyalty. He said, I'll give you an example. Once I decided we wanted to close down Fort DeRussy. I made a couple calls on it, this nice recreation beach that's owned by the Army still today on Hawaii, smack on some of that prime property. Mel's point in keeping it was this is the best place for R&R when they were coming back from the Vietnam War for a time before going out again. He said within an hour or so, there was an actual congressional resolution forbidding the closing of Fort DeRussy. It was on those matters, large and small. The most personal thing to me, I'm a baby boomer, and those of you who are here during a particular time period, that time period will remember something Mel did, the beginning of the lottery. Mel, when he came in, thought it was entirely inappropriate that America was drafting only the poor, that the wealthier students and the families could get out of it. Let's just set the National Guard to one side and these other things. But with a student deferment, Mel wanted to eliminate student deferments immediately and say that everyone was eligible, so to level the playing field. Well, if you can think to yourself, as he did in that first month or two, he thought, the first thing I want to do is change to lottery, and then I want to end the draft, but we're going to make it fairer to begin with. Who would be opposed to that? There were quite a few people opposed, but he found out very early the strongest lobby. Can any of you guess where it might have been? American university presidents. greatest growth in American colleges, tuition, professors, huge growth because of everybody wanting to avoid Vietnam. So you had a lot of students, C students in high school, normally wouldn't have ever gone to college, but I don't want to die, I'm going to college. So when that lottery occurred in December '69, many of us, myself included, we will never forget the males sitting there watching a TV as these balls came out, and the crying in that room and the cheering at the same time. The crying, those who had the first 30 numbers, whose birth dates were picked out. You pretty much knew anyone was going in the first 75 numbers. But if you were over 200, then you were pretty safe. So there was this tremendous emotion about what was going on. And I tried to explain that to Mel and say, this is the reason, it's not the lottery that I feel a personal obligation to you, it's what happened in Midway in mid-1969. Because Mel said he wanted to withdraw troops immediately to President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who was the National Security Advisor then. Kissinger said, absolutely not. Nixon was inclined not to withdraw anyone. And the reason was they wanted to negotiate with the North Vietnamese from a position of strength. If they started withdrawing soldiers, then it would look like we were leaving anyway, so the North Vietnamese might never come to the table. Mel was appalled because he thought we could be here 4 years from now. We could still be in Vietnam with the same number of troops because the North Vietnamese, in their negotiations, they can wait us out. So Nixon brokered, as he often did, arguments among his staffer. Kissinger said absolutely zero. Mel said 50,000 troops. You're going to announce 50,000 troops at Midway, and I'm standing by that. Nixon always knew if Mel said something very strongly, which he really did, that there was always a potential he would resign, which Nixon couldn't afford. Because the most extraordinary thing, or there were many, and I was astonished when I wrote the book that these were true, this held true. Mel Laird is the only defense secretary ever to serve who never lost a vote on Capitol Hill. Not one. Think about all those weapon systems, the draft votes. He won every vote. Now, I gave him a hard time about it. I said, you know, this one was close and this one was close, and you compromised behind the scenes. So you found out what they couldn't accept, and then you changed it slightly so that they would accept it. He said, yes, but that's part of it. The important thing is never to lose a vote. And that also occurred in '69, where the one vote he almost lost, and this is real politics, Mel was convinced he is very responsible for arms control. Kissinger will admit as much as Kissinger has been lauded for arms control, Mel deserves a lot of credit. Because Mel believed from the beginning that Soviets only wanted to negotiate on anti-ballistic missiles. For some reason, they were afraid of ABM, the early Star Wars, the later Star Wars. They weren't worried about our offensive missiles. They were worried we could develop a system faster and better than they could. And if we did, then we might have first strike weaponry because we were protected at the same time as we could hit them. They were very afraid of that. We wanted only to negotiate on offensive weapons. So there was this great argument, and many who are here will remember this, about why are we spending billions of dollars maybe building some holes in North Dakota and maybe having 10 sites, and is Washington going to be one of them where you have these anti-ballistic missiles? Mel even knew that the money in one extent was being wasted. But he felt it was important to get the vote, or the Soviets, if they voted down the system, continuing to build the system, the Soviets would never negotiate arms. And Kissinger finally agreed with this. He said it was clear that's why they were negotiating. Well, it came down to the most crucial vote. And there was a lady, very principled lady, Margaret Chase Smith, Senator Margaret Chase Smith. And one of her most famous talks, when you read her memoirs and people writing about her, is her amazing anti-ABM speech. There was an extraordinary thing that happened the day that the vote finally came into being. She had offered her own amendment, which was pretty close to the one that was going to be voted on that Mel couldn't accept. So he went to lobby her, and he said, Margaret, isn't there something that I can do for you or persuade you on this? And she gave him various reasons. He said, I'm sure there's something. And she looked at him and she says, well, Bill, I don't think he looks like he has enough medals on his chest. Margaret Chase Smith never married. She was a widow. I mean, she married once, but she never married again. However, It's debated by historians today whether they actually had a physical relationship, but they lived together in the same house, one upstairs, one downstairs, with Bill Lewis, who was her chief of staff on the defense committee in the Senate. And when they both retired, they had cottages right next to each other. And he has a significant place in her main museum. They were very close, and she insisted that he should be in the reserves. So prior to that time, Lyndon Johnson put him in the reserves. And his reserve assignment was to work at the Pentagon and help them with public relations, which is kind of a conflict. He's giving him money over here, and now he's promoting the Pentagon over here. But it was something they had to deal with. And so Mel said, well, I think I agree with you. I think we need to get him another medal. A few weeks later, there was a medal for him. That day, she changed her vote. An hour later, there was a Time magazine sidebar that said, the most extraordinary thing of the day is Margaret Chase Smith changing her vote against virtually her own amendment. These are the reasons that she gave. Well, now it can be told. See, I'm still an investigative reporter. Perhaps one of the most moving things to me about doing this book was that I want to leave no stone unturned. I was very concerned that when I started it that I would find a lot of things that Mel had done that was wrong or duplicitous or, crossed the line in my way of thinking as a crusading journalist. And it really is true. In the last part of my acknowledgments, you'll see a sentence that says, the true miracle to me is that I admire and respect Mel more today than when I started on the project. It was extraordinary what he was able to do during that time period. Some of the most fun stories in the book are Kissinger versus Mel. If ever two Machiavellis were evenly matched, it was these two men. The difference is Kissinger was overwhelmed by his ego. He was at least part creator of the Garden of Eden and everything afterwards. And it didn't matter to Mel. But Kissinger seems to have a wonderful sense of humor, and he does, and he can be self-deprecatory, but that's a charade. Henry Kissinger is very personally hurt when people say negative things about him, and it still worries him to this day. And he was very worried when I went to interview him. Of course, when I was writing on the Jack Anderson column, he was one of my chief, he could say I was one of his chief antagonists. Anytime I could find something on Henry Kissinger, I would run it. His dealings with the Chinese after he left the White House and so on. He was a favorite subject because he was a very colorful man. And I made the mistake, and those of you who know what I mean, when about 10 minutes into it, I mentioned Cy Hirsch's name, and the tenor changed a little. Cy Hirsch, who did the kind of the anti-Kissinger memoir. But I started talking about some of the things about he and Mel. And he really talked about how much he loved Mel. They'd maintained their friendship all over these years, because with Mel, it was never personal. But he could have fun. One of the things he did, he was tired of Kissinger always trying to find out what he was up to and trying to keep secret what he was doing. Because what you need to understand about the Pentagon, especially when it's someone as powerful as Mel was, they control most of the spying and most of the goodies. When you think about the goodies the president has, the Pentagon controls them. Camp David's theirs. The presidential yacht was the U.S. Navy's. Air Force One is the Air Force's. The White House communication system, run by the military. Every secret device, every plane that Kissinger used for all his secret trips were run by the military, who he somehow amazingly thought wouldn't ever tell their boss. Which boss made it clear from the very beginning, you owe your loyalty to only one person, and that's not the president. It's me. I got you this job, and you know that. Because the president may have agreed to it, but I picked all of you. And here is something that's never happened before. He also knew that intelligence was where the information was, and information is power. So when he got in there, he said, he realized he wanted his own man as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and his own man at the head of the National Security Agency, which is by far the biggest intelligence agency. It's the eavesdropping agency. It's bigger than all the other ones combined in terms of manpower and money. And so he approached a couple generals and he said, I want you to be the head of this agency. And if you do this at the end of the 4 years and are loyal to me, Let me know anything the White House wants you to do. You still do it for him because the president, the commander-in-chief, but you let me know. If you do this, I will get you a 3rd star. I will make sure before I leave you get a command in which you can get this 3rd or 4th star, whichever case it was at the time. And they did that, and that's why Mel knew everything that was going on, including, which Kissinger didn't know until my interview with him, about the secret peace talks in Paris. He knew not only that they were going there, he knew what Kissinger was saying. And it's interesting that I'm trying to get word on this book out to some historians because it should change some opinions ever so slightly. And here's one opinion. I know it's been changing Kissinger's. Kissinger told me there were no intercepts between Hanoi and Paris peace talk, their negotiators, back and forth that we intercepted and decoded. Well, Mel said there were many, and he read them. So he knew what Kissinger was saying every time because he was reading the North Vietnamese secret messages. And not only that, he knew what the North Vietnamese were going to do because from Hanoi came instructions to the Paris peace delegation about the next part of the negotiations and what they should do. And Secretary Kissinger said to me, there could be no such intercepts or decryption because I would have known about it. I was the man doing the negotiation. So I got back to my hotel room. About a half hour later, Mel is on the line and just laughing. He said, "What did you say to Henry? You told him about the NSA intercepts?" I said, "Yes." "What did he say to you?" "Well, he cursed me. If they were real, why didn't you ever give them to me?" I said, "Well, I'm your historian, and now I'm asking you the question, why our chief negotiator didn't have access to this incredible information?" He said, "Dale, you have to understand the chain of command. I was the Secretary of Defense. Nixon was only the National Security Advisor. I didn't report to Henry Kissinger. He wasn't Secretary of State yet. I didn't report to him. I reported to the Commander-in-Chief. If the Commander-in-Chief wanted to share it with him, fine." So I said, "Okay, what happened?" He said, "Well, the head of the NSA called me up. We got this new transcript. Would you like to see it?" "Yes." Courier sent over. Mel reads everything at his desk, and he says, "Okay, take it to the Oval Office now." The courier would go to the Oval Office, give it to the president. The president is reading it all. And then the courier sent back to the NSA with the documents. And I said, "Well, Mel, what did Kissinger say then when he realized what you were saying was true?" He said, "Well, he started calling Nixon a great number of names because he finally understood." I mean, Nixon, they were playing politics all the time within that administration. It was an internecine madhouse at times. Why would Nixon keep them secret? Because one thing it did, it made him appear prophetic. You read Kissinger's memoir without him knowing about how amazing it was at times that Nixon could predict what the North Vietnamese, what positions they were going to take at the next peace talks. And not only that, Kissinger said, he also did it, it's clear, to check up on me. It was his one way, since there was no one else in there but me that was American, to find out if I did what he told me to do, if I said what he told me to say. Well, I still couldn't believe it. How could it be 40 years later we're finding out about this? So I called Larry Eagleburger, a man who knew both Nixon, Kissinger, and Laird very well. And he started laughing and said, "Of course it happened. That's the way it was working in that White House." Even on a small thing, when Kissinger would come over to the Pentagon for his breakfast every week, he would always lean over and try to read the notes in Mel's notebook so that he could know what he was about to say. So Mel finally said to his aide, Colonel Bob Percy, he said, "You know, let's take a Kissinger document and let's write in red BS, but the full word. Let's just mark it up with red and make sure he would know it's his document, something he sent me, memory, and BS, BS, BS." So he said he brought it to the breakfast and he opened it up, and Kissinger changed ever so slightly. Magnificent actor. And then he turned the page. There was more red. Kissinger kept his composure. Except when there was a secret opening to China. Mel was scheduled to be the first Secretary of Defense ever to go to Japan. Ever. Not before World War II, first one after. And he was excited about the trip. He was going to meet with the defense minister, a man named Yasuhiro Nakasone, who he'd become great friends with, a man who later became prime minister. And he found out, Nixon, that Kissinger was going to be secretly signing the Shanghai Communique on one of the days in the week he was going to be in Japan. So he had his aide write up a new travel itinerary. The travel itinerary sent over to the White House that Kissinger had to sign off on said that on that day, Mel Laird would take a quick side trip to Taipei, Taiwan, where he would meet with the defense officials there and talk about the terrible People's Republic of China. On the very day Kissinger would be signing the Shanghai Communique. I said, how could you do that to him? He said, well, I just wanted to let him know if he wasn't going to tell me about things. It was supposed to be this great secret. I knew it was going on. I just wanted him to twist in the wind a little. For 2 weeks, Kissinger kept calling over and coming up with reasons. Mel, do you really think you ought to go to Taiwan? Because he knew Secretary of Defense Kissinger would deliver a very bellicose talk there, trashing the People's Republic of China, which would make it difficult for him to persuade Zhou Enlai that our position was changing, and certainly would change once this came out. And Mel let him off the hook about 3 or 4 days before. But there were never any planning for it. It was just the one memo. He never told anybody he needed an aircraft to go over there. And that's some of the things they did. But when I was writing this was one of the chapters called Dueling Machiavellis. When I was writing this, I tried to think of what it was that really mattered about their dueling. And I realized that at bottom, in the most important positions that Kissinger would oppose in the first year, Mel was right. So it was important for him to win. Withdrawing quickly, once he got that 25,000, as Kissinger predicted and said to me again, there's a very famous memo called the Salted Peanuts Memo, which was written in September '69. He said to Nixon, once we withdraw one American from there, the Americans will love it so much, like you can't eat one salted peanut. You'll just keep eating them. Once we withdraw one person, America will insist we continue withdrawings. Because so Kissinger admitted to me what was painfully obvious. He could barely get the peace negotiation in time, and he didn't, by the time Mel had withdrawn all the American troops. They were all withdrawn by the time the peace agreement was signed. So he was kind of in this race. But every one, like that first 25,000, every one of those men, draftees, for the most part, he saved their lives, saved their futures. So it made a huge difference. And I tried to explain that to Mel, that the difference that he made in terms of his lives and the impact in all those families. He never turned his back, also very significant, on Vietnam veterans. He was always proud of them. He never said anything negative. When I was doing this book, he said, make sure you talk about some of the great heroes. And you'll notice when you see the beginning, I didn't ask Mel permission. I didn't even tell him, but I dedicated it to the Vietnam veterans, the majority of whom served with great honor and distinction and valor. And he was very moved by that. We both were by the sacrifice of those veterans over there. And it was his gripe about McNamara's Apologia. I asked him what he thought when that book came out, because I needed to write it in this book, and he said, well, what upsets me is he never once complimented the troops. And that was the problem with Bob McNamara. He didn't care. He didn't care about the men he sent over there. He wasn't connected with them, whereas Mel was. So it made a huge difference. Well, let me close so that I can get some questions. I was thinking if there are any connections to the political campaign of this year. There's a very strong McCain connection, because Mel joined the U.S. Navy and went to World War II as part of the U.S. Navy, because McCain's grandfather was walking in the streets of Marshfield where a relative owned a store. Mel saw him in this beautiful white dress uniform and said, what is that? And he explained he was in the U.S. Navy. Mel was 10 years old. He said, I want to be in the Navy. Later, when he went to the Pacific Theater in that war, his commander was this man, Admiral McCain. He was over all the forces in the Pacific. And he said, we had a beer in Ulithi and talked about Marshfield and how he had inspired me. When he becomes Secretary of Defense, who was in charge of all the Pacific Naval Forces then? John McCain Sr., McCain's current father. So he's reporting to Mel at the same time as his son is a prisoner of war over in Vietnam. Extraordinary circumstance. Remembering Mel's service over there, one of the more extraordinary things that happened in writing this book, there's no explanation. I was writing when you see the first chapter, I was writing that first section the morning of 9/11. And it's a intricate description of the kamikaze strike by a plane on the USS Maddox, where Ensign Laird was hit and almost killed, as were several of his mates. The bomb exploded inside with the plane, and he still has like 30 or 40 pieces of shrapnel that slowly worked their way out. He had 100 or 150 pieces of shrapnel in him as a result of that. And I asked him once, I said, you know, when you were over talking to Nakasone, here's the Japanese defense minister who was fighting you from the other side, and you've got this shrapnel inside you. And if he's being very bellicose and saying this and that, weren't you tempted at some point to say, you know, you're lucky I'm even sitting here across from you? He said, no, but I just wryly said after one too many sake toasts. He said, the greatest number of medals I won from the war came from the Japanese. Every medal. And he said a hush fell on the Japanese Defense Ministry. They dealt with him a little more gingerly after that. He was very politic about the way that he did things. An Obama connection, there's kind of an extraordinary one. Oh, what I was mentioning is I'm writing Kamikaze Strike, and I'm watching on TV as the first plane hits the Trade Center. Also that morning, appearing in the New York Times, excerpts and a very flattering interview with Bill Ayers, who was one of the chief leaders of the radical group, the Weathermen. And in that interview, front page of the, not front page of the New York Times, the front of the arts section, is this long interview with him saying he didn't bomb enough when he was a weatherman, 9/11. Well, that was one book tour that ended swiftly because the rest of the time he had to try to explain why. Because Bill Ayers was the man who first bombed the Pentagon and bragged about it in his memoir in 2001. He said, it was a beautiful day when we bombed the bastards, of whom Mel was the chief one. Speaking of that phrase, Mel was always a little concerned at times that Nixon wasn't quite himself when he was giving him orders, that he would be very bellicose. He wanted to attack the North Koreans after they shot down an unarmed EC-121. It was Mel, as you'll see in both of their memoirs, who talked them out of attacking in retaliation, which might have started another Korean war. But in September 1970, and during a terrorist incident in which some of our planes were taken by Palestinian terrorists and taken to Jordan, at one point, very late in the night, Mel finally admitted to me he doesn't like to say negative things about anyone, really. It's a surprise, very difficult for a biographer, very unhappy. That's why I had to do 500 interviews so I could get the whole story instead of Mel not telling me all the time. But he called him and said, bomb the bastards. Now, Mel was convinced that many of the hostages, if they bombed these planes, that many of the hostages were still there. So Mel, but this was the commander-in-chief. So Mel quickly called, he had a great relationship with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He quickly called the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and said, you're going to get a call from the White House about bombing over there. This is what you will tell them, that you've checked, and the weather isn't appropriate. There is bad weather there, so we cannot bomb them effectively. And the chairman said, well, how long is the weather going to be bad for? And Mel said, I think 2 days will do it. I think 48 hours. And Nixon did change his mind. Once the weather supposedly cleared up, he said, nah, we don't need to do that. A lot of people he mentored over the years. There's no one, with the possible exception that I know of in Washington after my 30 years there, who had more friends and more influence behind the scenes than possibly George H.W. Bush, in terms of the way they would send kind notes to people and never offend anyone and keep loyalty with people. And part of that loyalty is this extraordinary dramatic circumstance that I urge you to read about in the book. In 1973, the last thing Mel wanted to do, he wanted to leave the Pentagon. He always made the case, called it the McNamara rule, no Secretary of Defense should ever serve for 2 terms. They always go bad the second term. And he tried to tell Caspar Weinberger that. You'll just go downhill. It's too long. He tried to tell his friend Donald Rumsfeld that. You just go downhill. 1 term is perfect. The first press conference he gave at the Pentagon, they said, are you going to be here for 2 terms if he wins again? He said, absolutely not. I've already called the taxi company. I have it ordered for January 19th, 1973. He will be at the door and I will be leaving. And he was thrilled to be able to do that, as was his wife, Barbara, who had supported him during all this time, even though she did not like Nixon. And it was a very strong feeling. And his mother, who was very influential with him, very smart woman on her own, has her own biography, a very good biography. They were opposed to him working for Nixon. Now they were excited. He's leaving the Nixon administration, January 73. Watergate is starting to begin. I mean, now it's starting to really come out. In June 1973, probably something most of you, unless you're historians or Dr. McCracken, will remember. The White House was going down so quickly that Haldeman and Ehrlichman, of course, had to resign before they were indicted, Chief of Staff and Domestic Counselor. The Hill was very worried. They knew the president wasn't paying any attention to what was most important in the country, which was the domestic budget. And they needed someone in there they could trust, that they could work with to get that budget through, to get all the items that they needed on both sides. So they begged Mel. They came to the basement of his house. Democrats and Republican leadership of Capitol Hill came there and said, Mel, if Nixon offers it to you, will you replace Ehrlichman? Will you become the domestic counselor? He thought about it, and then he talked to his wife. And his wife said, you will not accept this position at a minimum until you confront Nixon himself and ask him if he's guilty. He's the only person I know of who did that. Not George H.W. Bush, not anyone who was around him. Actually asked him in the middle of that, are you guilty? He went to Camp David, asked him, and he said, I said, what did he say? Nixon lied to me. There are a couple things that he feels great betrayal about. Bob McNamara and the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, and this lie from Nixon. But the man who really persuaded him to come in was his friend and former general counsel for 4 years at the Pentagon, Fred Buzzard, who by this time was Nixon's Watergate lawyer, White House lawyer. The lawyer tells him, I've seen everything, I know everything, he's not guilty, please come and help us. This is June 1973. Now, a couple weeks later, Fred Buzzard hears for the first time about the tapes. They weren't known. And then he started listening to them. Fred Buzzard, a lawyer, broke privilege with his client and called Mel, had a secret meeting with him, and told him, I've heard the tapes, Nixon is guilty. You think Mel Laird, having had such an honorable career, wanted to be in a White House where the president's own lawyer was secretly telling him the president was guilty? Now he had this knowledge. What could he do? What could he say? He couldn't hurt his friend Fred, who would lose his license, among other things, might even go to jail for this. But he had to confront Nixon. So there was this extraordinary occurrence where he knew that Nixon, at certain times of the day, had a hideaway office in the executive office building across the street from the White House, where most of the White House staffers work, and that he would go from the White House to the executive office building, and he knew when to catch him. Within hours of talking to Fred, he buttonholed Nixon. The Secret Service backed off. And he said, you son of a bitch, you lied to me. And I kept wondering, what could Nixon say? They've been friends for 20 years. He knows Mel. If Mel's saying that, he doesn't ask, who told you that? He doesn't even have to know. He knows Mel knows. He has sources. And he can't say he's guilty because his lawyer would say, don't admit to anyone you're guilty. So there was a pause, and typical of Nixon, he said, are you going to leave? He didn't deny it. He didn't agree with it. He said, are you going to leave? And Mel indicated he would. In the next few days, from Capitol Hill came down the leadership again to his house and said, we've heard you're going to leave. Well, he couldn't tell him why. He couldn't tell him he was on a super-sinking ship. So he just said, I have some disagreements with the president that I cannot stomach. And they said, but you have to stay. All he's doing is Watergate. That's what he's obsessed with. He's not talking to anybody about this. Will you please stay? Mel finally agreed to stay. And in that, that is one of the most patriotic moments ever for me, when he agreed to stay. And I told him, I read his speeches. In the next 2 weeks, he kept referring to Thomas Paine. Nobody knew why he was, not even that they noticed it. These are the times that try men's souls. Sunshine Patriots. He was going to be a real patriot. He was giving a signal. He knew what was going on. Over the next 9 months, what I pieced together for the book that I believe is irrefutable One man, more than anyone else besides Nixon himself, brought Nixon down, and that was Mel Laird. Because whether he planned it or not, Mel Laird put into place the three players that would bring Nixon down. And the first one was the man who this library is named after. How long can Nixon hold on if he doesn't have a vice president and not be impeached? Does Congress really in that crisis want to impeach him when there's no 25th Amendment produced vice president? I think in the back of his mind, the one candidate that he wanted, he wouldn't get off him, was John Connally. Many of you remember John Connally as having been shot as governor in Dallas, Texas on that fateful day with John F. Kennedy. Brilliant man, great politician. Nixon was in love with him. That's the way Sapphire and Buchanan put it. They never saw him in love with the man before, but he was in love with John Connally and talked John Connally into being Secretary of the Treasury. I don't mean it was a physical love. I just mean he was so enamored, nobody could talk him out of it. And during that time, he changed from the Democratic Party to Republican Party. Do you think Capitol Hill, knowing that they might impeach this president and the next president might be John Connally, do you think the Republicans were likely to confirm a man who had just been a Democrat only days ago and trust him as a Republican president? Do you think the Democrats want to put in place, potentially for president, a man who betrayed them? Only recently, not even for this book, Mel keeps telling me things later. He said, did I ever tell you that about a few weeks into the Ford, after we had nominated him, did I ever tell you that I had to have a one-on-one with Carl Albert? I had to dress him down because I found out he was starting to feel that he wanted to be president. And if they held off the confirmation hearings on Ford long enough and they impeached Nixon fast enough, the Speaker of the House, Democrat, would become President of the United States. They said, no, you never told me that. I suspected it. I had sources. I went over to see him and said, you better move this thing faster now. There's nothing wrong with Jerry. You have to confirm him. He's as clean as a hound's tooth, is the way he put it. And that was kind of an extraordinary circumstance. Once he puts in Ford, his friend, he now knows he can leave the White House. I think that was an ulterior motive for him because there was no one better to pass the domestic budget besides Mel than Jerry Ford, acting as vice president. And he was tired of using the auto pen. He confessed to me there were hundreds of things that the President Nixon signed he never saw or knew about. Capitol Hill bills by the auto pen in the basement with him and Bryce Harlow because he wouldn't pay attention. He said, I knew he would approve these if we could ever get his attention, but we couldn't. So he puts in Ford. Now you have a vice president that's viable. Now, remember the Saturday Night Massacre, October 1973? The Attorney General won't fire him. The Special Prosecutor, Archibald Cox, even though Nixon has ordered him to, he resigns. The number two refuses to fire him, and it goes down until a man named Robert Bork finally agrees, I will act as a Justice Department official, and I will fire him. And Elliot Richardson was fired, along with Archibald Cox and others. Mel knew it was going to occur that weekend. He closeted with Bill Archer, a young congressman, and said, who can we get in there with the great integrity that the Democrats would accept as well as Republicans? They scoured and thought, and Archer said to him, a guy named Leon Jaworski. Mel said, okay, tell me about him. He didn't even know him. And they talked about him, and within 2 or 3 days, they had Jaworski approved, with the president signing off, convinced that he would not be anti-Nixon, as anti-Nixon as Cox had been. In the end, he was right, and I'll end with that. But Jaworski now forces the disclosure of the Watergate tapes, and that they're serious and wants to make them public, goes to the Supreme Court, and he is bringing Nixon down. Well, there's one more piece. Can't impeach the President of the United States without the House of Representatives. And they had appointed a special committee, Pete Rodino. And most of you who know Washington know who's going to call the shots on that committee. Yes, it's probably the chairman, but there's really one person who guides everything, and that's the chief counsel, the lawyer who's leading all the interns and all the other lawyers and who tells Rodino what they need to do next. And Mel called a few days before. He had hundreds of applications to be, can you imagine, to be the lawyer that would bring a president down? Everybody wanted to be Rodino's chief counsel. Mel called him and said, there's only one man for the job. He's a friend of mine, by the way. His name is John Doerr. He's from Wisconsin. I've known him since then. The Democrats loved him. He was the head of civil rights in the Justice Department during the Kennedy administration. He was a magnificent man, tremendously moral. Pick him. The next day, a few days later, because he had to vet him, his name was among the hundreds that were proposed by others. If you look at the press conference when Rodino announced John Doerr as the chief counsel and why he would be impartial, you'll see he only mentions one name. He was asked by the reporters, will the Republicans ever agree to this? How does the White House feel? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, White House domestic counselor Mel Laird was the one who recommended him to me. So he put into place the three men that would bring him down. And interestingly, at the very end, one of the first time ever in this book, never anywhere else, Jaworski was not going to indict Nixon. And that has extraordinary implications, especially for this library, which would have been a longer term. Most historians agree that the difference in the 1976 election was the Nixon pardon by Ford. An honorable thing, there was no deal. Mel was furious when Ford told them, because Ford didn't really counsel with anyone. He talked to people, but it was very early after he had become president. And they were out on the golf course. They were partners in a tournament. And they were doing pretty well. And Jerry said between one of the holes, I'm going to announce at 3 o'clock today on Sunday that I'm pardoning Nixon. What do you think about that? Mel was angry because he loved President Ford. He loved his friend, and he knew this would be disastrous. He wasn't angry because of the pardon. He always said it was a courageous thing and the right thing to do. He always said, and he said to Ford later that day, the first thing he said to Ford was, I think we're winning this tournament. Let's not talk about it until after we're done. And after they were done, he said, can't you wait? If you just give me a week, I will have calls from Capitol Hill for the pardon. I will start a groundswell, just as he had done to make Ford vice president. I will start it from all kinds of places, from media friends, that what this country needs to move on is a pardon of Richard Nixon. I will make it so within a couple weeks, it'll look like it's something everybody wants. And you won't take the hit yourself. He said, no, I'm doing it today. Well, what Laird didn't know, nobody knew it. And then about 2 weeks later, his friend Leon Jaworski told him after the pardon, he said, no, Mel, I thought you ought to know since you helped select me. I was planning not to indict him. Because it was going to come in September, the final recommendation of the special prosecutor. And it was his decision alone, not his team. Was he going to indict him for these Watergate crimes? And his reasoning was, if you read his memoirs, very interesting, this is the way the world really works. Reader's Digest published his memoirs. In his memoirs, he had that, the original. But that was taken out because at the time he was a huge hero for bringing Nixon down. So to have this ending where he had decided not to indict Nixon would have taken away from that luster, and it might not have been a bestseller. At least that's my read of it. And why? You can read Jaworski's memoir. The reason, as Mel said, and Bill Archer, I had him on a conference call because he told both Congressman Bill Archer and Mel that's what he was going to do, but now he didn't have to do anything. The reason was he was convinced that Richard Nixon, there was no place in the United States that he could get a fair trial. That if you spent all this time and money and put the country through all this agony because everybody knew about Watergate, it would be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would have to let him off on the basis there was no place you could get 12 jurors of mental competence who hadn't heard about this or might not have some prior judgment. Well, thank you. Sat here very patiently. As you can see, I'm very enthusiastic about this book. Are there any questions or objections? Or yes?
Thank you very much. First, I had a chance to scan the book today. I bought a copy, and congratulations. It's clear and a page-turner.
Yes.
And your performance tonight was highly eloquent, so congratulations.
And the only unfactual thing in there is my picture at the back. Sorry, I look much younger there. That's the way That's the way I looked when I started the book. I have aged a great deal. So everything else is true, but I know that picture looks odd.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One of them, did you and Mel Laird have any differences of opinion over anything as you were writing this? And when you did, whose will prevailed in the printed text?
Even though Mel did arrange for the funding, but Mel was really one of these extraordinary politicians, you can see it back then, who loves debate, never frightened by it. So I won on every issue that was important to me. But I will tell you, it was odd. It's an excellent question. The longest, most acrimonious debate we had, which went on for hours over a period of months, was over Joe McCarthy, which didn't end up much in the book because yes, he started as a congressman in 1953 from Wisconsin. He knew McCarthy. He had some anecdotes that we used, but he really disliked McCarthy instinctively, as did Ford, who was in the next state over, Michigan. But he felt the press overblew that. I said, people committed suicide. It was a terrible thing. He said, well, the media made it terrible. I said, no, it was Joe McCarthy. And we never resolved that, but it wasn't important for the book. Mel is much more favorable. I would tell you the most important thing that we constantly disagreed about was Henry Kissinger. I started this book with a severe animus toward Henry Kissinger. So it was all I could do to kind of ratchet to a little more objective. But believe me, there are things in there about Kissinger he would never have written. And I suspected it was one of the reasons in the end I really wanted to persuade him to do it as an autobiography. I really wanted an honest memoir that would sit next to these two dishonest memoirs, Nixon and Kissinger's. I wanted Mel's right there, the one man that didn't have to apologize for anything he did, or deny anything, or was guilty of anything. So I would say throughout, things that I say about Kissinger, Mel was not happy with. He wanted to remain friends, and he liked him.
Very good.
Thank you.
Your opening paragraph mentions his friendship for Nixon at the same time as his lack of trust for Nixon. Nixon claimed to have a secret plan for ending the war in Vietnam, and Laird knew that his old friend Nixon did not have a secret plan. How could he be friendly with somebody whom he didn't trust?
That's a very good question. Of course, he couldn't have worked on Capitol Hill if he couldn't work with anyone and be friends with people he didn't trust, because not all the people in power on Capitol Hill were trustworthy, but he had to deal with them. It is interesting to me. It really is. I mean, he would say the 68 thing was political, the secret plan, and you'll never find a speech, and you can't, where he says, I have a secret plan to get out of Vietnam. It's actually, the way it happened was New York Times reporter was talking to him early in 68, I think, on a plane, and he asked him if he had a plan, and he said something to the effect, if I did have one, I couldn't tell you, because I wouldn't want to tell the North Vietnamese. And that's kind of where it came out of. If you find an actual quote where Nixon said that, I'll be shocked. The Nixon archives have searched for it. So he would say he took advantage of the belief that he had a secret plan out there. But Mel was shrewd and could be carefully deceptive about some things himself. Not an outright lie, but when it came to politics, kind of like David Broder said, dedication of the Laird Center over in Marshfield Clinic back 10 years ago, the politics, he knew politics was fun, and it was the only game worthwhile for grown-ups to play. So the time he felt betrayed was that day, and that ended it. You won't find calls. You won't even find him dealing with Nixon much throughout while he's his own domestic counselor. In fact, during all the press reports, they always say he never sees the president, even though he's in this powerful position. The president's still only seeing, Ron Ziegler and Henry Kissinger. He would always point out that's why Watergate happened besides Nixon. Nixon deliberately surrounded himself in those years with three non-politicians who were yes men. Kissinger, Haldeman and Ehrlichman, but later Ziegler and another individual, none of whom had ever run for election. He said if he had talked to any professional politicians, you can read the Watergate transcripts, what's happening, and you can see that Mel Laird walks into the Oval Office and they've just been talking about doing something illegal. Let's break into the Brookings Institution safe and get the Pentagon Papers, or do this or that. They're cursing up a storm, and then it stops when Mel comes in. One of the more emotional moments for me, I should say, is very early on interviewing President Ford out in Vail. And one of the things I said to him is that one of the things I really admire about you, which is rare in presidents, is that you're not afraid to have people working for you who are smarter than you. He didn't take offense at all. I said, because, when you look at the pick of Dan Quayle, there are certain people presidents who don't want someone to overshadow them or debate with them. Ford was extraordinary that way, wanting to hear all the negatives about himself and being able to live with it and become a better person as a result. He said, that's the way I always feel my friend Nixon fell down. He ended up in this boys' club with Haldeman and Ehrlichman. When I read those Watergate transcripts, he was using language I had never heard him use, and I had been friends since the 40s with him. So, he was trying to blame in our conversation all of Nixon's peccadillos on these two men who were encouraging him into the bad things. Whereas I was saying...
Ford or Laird?
Ford. He was saying that. Laird agreed that he changed language, but he felt Nixon still made the decision himself. It still derived from his own paranoia, the whole Watergate mess. Any other questions? Thank you. You don't dare, because he may answer for 10 minutes. Yes?
You made a reference to an Obama connection, and then you didn't quite finish it.
It'll come out more and more, and it's come out before. Bill Ayers was a financial contributor in Chicago to Barack Obama, and he has been trying to distance himself from this former domestic terrorist who has become kind of a liberal icon in Chicago. So that's it. I think the Republicans will use it more. I think you'll see it in ads in about a month from now. They'll have pictures of him and Ayers. They'll say he gave $750. He met with him at this council thing, got advice from him, and so on. So it was just the same guy who tried to kill Mel, bombing the Pentagon, was a friend later in his repentant state, but not so repentant with our current presidential candidate. And that's not a knock on him, because I'm not going to tell you who I'm going to vote for, but it's not obvious to me yet. So.
It wasn't a daytime bombing, was it?
Yeah, no, it was a nighttime bombing, and it was kind of silly. It was kind of, no, it wasn't personal. It was, it was one of my favorite things that they edited down. I had a whole chapter on it because I loved the fact that the weathermen were using Bob Dylan's lyrics to name everything. The Pentagon was Maggie's farm. They were called the Weathermen because of Bob Dylan lyrics. And so they used all these type of words, and it was kind of funny to read what they were, that whole Pentagon operation that went on for several months, and they blew up a toilet, okay, in the Air Force section, and they did it deliberately at night, set a bomb in a grate, I think it was, so no one would be harmed. So, but some will make more of it. They did do other bombs, I mean, that were harmful. Of course, mostly themselves. 2 of the weathermen were killed in New York. Any other questions? Yes?
I still have moments. I hope no one asked this question. Tell us about Mel Laird today. Where is he living? What is he doing? His family? Some of the personal things about him.
Mel is...
And how old is he?
1922. I have to think about it. On September 1st, his birthday, he turned 86. He's 86 years old. He was doing quite well until about a year ago. He had some issues with his knees and had knee operations, and the most serious issue was that when one of the knees gave way, and probably due to medication, some of you people know what this is like, medication that makes you feel fuzzy because it's for the pain or whatever else, he tried to get up and he fell down and hit his head very hard. So he went through a difficult time period, but he's now come back quite strong, is living in Fort Myers, Florida. We expect and hope, I've seen him a couple times, we expect and hope that he will come to Wisconsin, Marshfield in October for a 2-day dedication of an addition to the Laird Center, a $40 million addition to all the scientific work they're doing on genetics and everything else, that extraordinary clinic. So. He's doing much better than he was a year ago. But if you're asking me as an author, he's doing terrible. I wanted him to do all this publicity. I wanted him to be interviewed, and he's doing more of that now, but I wanted Diane Sawyer to have him on. So as a result, I'm playing a little catch up. But now he's being more open about it. He's done some interviews recently and is back as far as I'm concerned. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Oh, yes, one question. All right. Well, and I'll take this as the last question. Most of you have been very patient. And if you have any, I'll talk with you afterwards.
I was going to mention that James Caldwell in The House of War speaks very highly of McNamara and his apology for what he did in the war. And as a historian of modern Germany, I respect contrition. You do things wrong, you acknowledge them. And one of the things that McNamara was very sorry about with regard to the war was the use of napalm. And recently, the Americans have made an offer. I come as a foreigner to your country to offer $3 million as compensation to 3 million Vietnamese with regard to the difficulties resulting to the present and future generations. If the Germans had offered 13 million to slave laborers, I think we'd have had a great outcry. And that's why I thought that McNamara's being worried about the war and his role in it is an important point to rethink the past. And I wonder why you take Laird's side.
It was a very specific thing I said. You have a very fair point. There's absolutely no question, personally, McNamara was really falling apart in the last year. I mean, yes, it was evident then. It wasn't, you didn't have to wait for an apology for 30 years. He felt it had been a mistake, but didn't say so then. And in fact, during that time, toward the beginning of that time, there's an anecdote in the book where he comes, of course, Mel was known as the toughest questioner in the executive session of the defense appropriations, so McNamara was always coming before him. He was tougher on McNamara after Gulf of Tonkin, after it was not clear about the second attack. And he said, I knew Bob was losing it, is the way he put it, when he nearly came across the table to hit Mel, when Mel asked him if he was lying about something. And he said it was a good time for him to go. I would say Mel was positive about his apology. There's no way he said it was wrong for him to apologize. And Mel would say, amen. He should, because that's the way he felt then. Now it's finally time to say so. What his gripe was that I was quoting, that I would agree with, is that he didn't recognize the soldiers and talk about them in that memoir. Now, maybe it was too painful to apologize and at the same time realize you sent a lot of these men to their death and living death. If you knew for a couple of years as the buildup was occurring and didn't say anything. I would say Mel, who always spoke his mind, would never fully appreciate someone who has such objections to something he's doing and is in a position to change it and doesn't do so. Is that carefully said? But he was never attacking the apology, just the fact that in that book the soldiers aren't mentioned, their sacrifices and his appreciation for them despite the fact that it was not a good thing to do. And last question was there.
Appreciating the results of your collaboration with Jack Anderson.
Yeah. Yeah, when Jack vouched for Mel, I said when Jack vouched for Mel, I thought that was extraordinary. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask if you had any conversation with Mr. Laird in relationship to Allen Dulles.
That's an interesting question. No. What makes you ask the question?
I was just curious if you had an opinion.
I mean, I asked him about Hoover. I mean, Dulles was the spy master and so on. I think he would have had great respect for him if I know Mel and a lot of the things that he did, as well as John Foster Dulles. I was unfortunately asking him more about Hoover because I wanted to know, since Hoover was coming over to see Ford and others and showing him his secret files on Martin Luther King and others, how he felt about that. But that's in the book. Thank you very much.
I have to reach below for a package here. You are the first recipient of a gift that we have researched and had created for our speakers, and this is a pair of pens with the signature of Gerald Ford for your writing pleasure, for your future works. And so we thank you so much for coming and being a wonderful speaker. And I will put you on notice that I hope your schedule isn't so full, because I would love to have you come to the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids and give this talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a real honor.